On the 24th of May, 2022, at around 12 p.m., a 911 call was made to the Uvalde Police Department by a fourth grader at Robb Elementary School. The child was pleading for help and telling the dispatcher that multiple people were dead. Police rushed to the scene, and what ensued was one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history, with it taking police over an hour to confront the assailant, leaving dozens of children dead, and the world shocked and appalled over the police's response to the shooting. Before this video starts, this channel is supported by my Patreon. On Patreon, you get uncensored versions of videos, early access to uploads, and shoutouts in future videos. Your support helps fund deeper research and keeps this channel independent. Links are below if you'd like to join. On the 16th of May, 2004, Salvador Rolando Ramos Sr. and Adriana Reyes welcomed their next child into the world, naming him Salvador Ramos Jr., taking the name of his father, Salvador Ramos Sr. Salvador Ramos was born in Fargo, North Dakota, but would later move to Uvalde, Texas, a city in Texas that houses around 15,000 residents and is around 60 miles from the Mexican border. Uvalde is a Hispanic majority city, and in fact, in 2022, around 90% of Robb Elementary students were in fact Hispanic. Salvador was quite close to his extended family when he was younger, especially his cousins and grandparents. He came from a lower class family. This is known as Salvador once spoke about having to sleep under a towel instead of a blanket, claiming his father was never around and was either in jail or out of town. In the year 2000, 4 years before Salvador was born, Salvador's father got into a fight with a police officer after resisting arrest. He was sentenced to 180 days in a county jail as a result of this incident. This wasn't his only run-in with the law. He was also later charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. During his childhood years, a few disturbing behavioral signs began to come to light. From a young age, Salvador was described as quiet, withdrawn, and socially awkward. He found it difficult to form friendships with other people and was often known to prefer being alone. Salvador was also known to frequently move from different homes and staying with different family members during his childhood. Whilst it's not known why this was the case, it is known that Salvador often had conflicts with certain family members when he was young. Witnesses claim that Salvador had a very unstable childhood, getting more and more unstable as he attended school. Salvador Ramos attended Robb Elementary School around 2012 when he was 5 or 6 years old. It was reported that during his years at Robb Elementary School, Ramos was frequently bullied for his speech impediment and social challenges. This has since been disputed, however, as an old friend of Salvador from high school described him as not being bullied and in fact a bully.
Ivan also says he knew the gunman well and described him as a bully.
Salvador Ramos was a boy who was not bullied. He would try to pick on people but fail, and it would aggravate him. I would like to get that out of the way. He was not bullied.
Following his years at Robb Elementary School and middle school, he enrolled into Uvalde High School, which was a high school that took students from grade 9 to grade 12. Not much is known about his high school years. However, it is known that during Salvador's time at high school, his attendance began to slip, slowly decreasing. As well as this, his performance also slipped, with him failing every class he was in. Salvador would later be involuntarily withdrawn from high school around the 9th grade by school officials, after his attendance and performance was taken into question. After being withdrawn from high school, Ramos primarily lived with his grandmother, Celia Gonzalez, with his home life remaining, quote, tense and unstable. Ramos spent much of his time alone in his room, being described by friends and neighbors as quiet, withdrawn, and isolated. Around early 2022, when Ramos was 17 years old, he began to become more irritable and angry, with friends claiming he cut ties with them with no explanation. Around this time, he was known to spend a lot of time online. What no one knew, however, was that Ramos was planning something horrific, something that would be revealed in the days after his 18th birthday. In the months before the 24th of May, 2022, Ramos began to post on his social media accounts, hinting to, quote, something big occurring in a few months. His friends and acquaintances saw this but believed he was just joking and did not take him serious. Salvador, who went under the name The Biggest Op on Instagram, began using the app to communicate with a girl from Germany. He met this girl on Ubo around the end of April 2022. He also asked one user to repost his gun pictures on Instagram. In a row of messages he sent to someone on Uvalde, he tried his best to get the other party's attention, but did not get a reply. As a result, he told them to kill themselves. Salvador was known to allegedly hurt animals, with some alleging he looked up to Luca Magnotta, the subject of Netflix's Don't Fuck with Cats series. Some alleged he killed cats and would put them in vacuum-sealed bags around his neighborhood. He was also allegedly known to harass girls on apps like Instagram and Yubo, often threatening to kidnap or hurt them. Despite these warning signs, there was no intervention, with people only realizing too late. On the 16th of May 2022, Salvador turned 18 years old, meaning he could legally buy firearms in the state of Texas. On the same day he turned 18, he traveled to a gun store and purchased 2 AR-style rifles as well as ammunition. In Texas, the law permits buying rifles at 18, but does not allow anyone under 21 to purchase any handguns. The purchases of these rifles marked a point in Salvador's horrific plan. Later that same day, he had made the decision to carry out the attack just 8 days later, on Tuesday, the 24th of May, 2022. In the hours before the attack, Salvador sent messages to a believed teenage friend online from Germany, where he said, "At 7 a.m., I'll text you in an hour, but you have to respond. I have a little secret I want to tell you." In response, they said, "I might be taking a nap because I'm really sick, but if I'm awake, I will." Salvador responded, "Bet." Before then saying 2 hours later, at 9 a.m., "I'ma air out." The friend wrote back a few hours later at around 1:30 p.m. saying, "What?" A few hours later, he texted back saying, "I just shot my grandmother in her head. I'ma go shoot up an elementary school now." The girl responded hours later as she was asleep saying, "I just saw the news, but by this time, it was too late." Salvador had already begun to carry out his horrific acts of violence that shocked the community as well as the world. The day was the 24th of May, 2022. What started as a normal day for most of Uvalde's residents would quickly turn into a day that was remembered as one of the darkest days in the history of the nation. At around 11 a.m. on the 24th of May, 2022, Salvador got into an argument with his grandmother, Celia Gonzalez, who was 66, about Salvador's failure to graduate from high school. This argument got very heated. Salvador would go to his room and retrieve his AR-style rifle before shooting his grandmother in the head. She went on to survive, but was in critical condition after being airlifted to a hospital. Salvador then messaged a teenage girl from Germany and told her he had shot his grandmother in the head, and that he was going to shoot up an elementary school. Salvador then took his grandmother's black 2008 Ford F-150 and traveled towards Robb Elementary School. Salvador would crash his grandmother's car, which by this point was in a concrete ditch outside of the school. Salvador left the car and scaled the fence and jumped into the school grounds. Salvador was now armed and on the campus of the school. A witness claimed that Salvador fired towards 2 people at a nearby funeral home who came to check on the crashed car. However, both made it out uninjured. At this point, police began to receive calls about a crashed car at the school. After hearing of this, a school official would drive past the crash, and in doing so, would drive past Salvador himself, who was walking towards the entrance of the elementary school. Salvador walked towards the west-facing entrance of the school, which at this point had been closed by a teacher who had seen him. Despite the teacher's attempt at closing the door did not in fact lock, despite being designed to lock. After entering the school, Salvador walked down 2 short hallways before entering a classroom that was internally attached to another classroom. It would be these 2 classrooms, classroom 111 and 112, that the entirety of the shooting would take place. A teacher within the classroom, Irma Garcia, who was a 4th grade maths and reading teacher, attempted to lock the doors to the classroom. In doing so, Salvador would shoot the door's window, smashing it instantly, before backing Irma Garcia into a corner and said, "Good night," as he shot and killed her. A survivor of the shooting recounted that Salvador said, "You're all going to die," before he opened fire on the students and another teacher within the classroom. A surviving student claimed that Salvador played sad music out loud whilst he carried out the shooting. After shooting and killing multiple students inside the classroom, Salvador would scoop up their blood and write LOL on a chalkboard. 911 calls flooded the Uvalde Police Department, who by this point were already en route to the school, but it would take over an hour of shooting and Salvador being in the classroom before the shooting ended. Salvador was in the classroom for over an hour, whilst armed police stayed outside of the classroom and building. Due to the lack of police response, many students played dead and started to phone 911. 10-year-old Chloe Torres, who was a 4th grade student and was trapped inside one of the classrooms that Salvador was in, she used a teacher's phone who had been shot and dialed 911. She whispered that people had been shot and killed and that the gunman was in the room with her, at one point even begging for police to hurry up and enter the room. However, they didn't.
Hello. No, there's a school shooting.
Okay, yes, ma'am. I have multiple units there. Are you with officers or are you barricaded somewhere?
I'm in classroom. What's the classroom number? 112.
112?
112, yes, ma'am.
What's your name, ma'am?
Chloe Torres, please hurry. There's a lot of dead bodies.
Caroline, okay? You just classroom 112?
Yes, ma'am. Please help.
One student, 11-year-old Maya Cirillo, smeared herself with the blood of one of her dead classmates in order to hide from Salvador. Salvador continued shooting and went up to one student and then crouching down next to them and saying, "It's time to die," before then opening fire. Arnulfo Reyes, who was a teacher in classroom 111 and was already in fact suffering multiple gunshot wounds, instructed his students to get under desks and act as if they were asleep. Salvador would hear this and walk toward classroom 111 from classroom 112. He then shot Arnulfo Reyes and began randomly firing at students in classroom 111. All 11 students that were trapped in classroom 111 at the time of the shooting were sadly killed by Ramos. The teacher, Arnulfo Reyes, was on the floor at this point. Salvador saw this and began to taunt the teacher, throwing blood on his face as well as pouring water on the teacher's back. Despite this, Arnulfo Reyes went on to survive the attack. While still inside classroom 111, Ramos started to stop on his victims, as well as hitting and spitting on them whilst they were on the floor. According to Arnulfo Reyes, he actually heard law enforcement approach the classroom that Salvador was in. However, they did not enter. During one of these occasions, he heard a student from the adjoining classroom, classroom 112, saying, "Officer, we are in here. We are in here." However, law enforcement by this point had already walked away from the classrooms. Law enforcement at this point were blocking the hallways outside of classroom 112 and 111 and were even heard asking Salvador to come out of the classrooms and talk, saying they did not want to hurt anyone. Ramos briefly began firing at the officers in the hallway, grazing 2 in the process. This was when the officers present retreated and stationed themselves around a corner within the hallway. 19 officers gathered in the hallway, but did not enter the classroom that Salvador was in, as the alleged incident commander, Pedro Arredondo, treated the situation as one with a quote, barricaded subject, not an active shooter incident. By this point, a student who was still alive in the classroom called 911 for a 3rd time, claiming multiple people were dead and begging for police to intercept. At 12:21 p.m., whilst police were stationed outside the classroom and were attempting to talk to Salvador, 4 more shots were heard inside the classroom. 2 minutes later, at 12:23 p.m., during the shooting, Jacob Alvarado, an off-duty Border Patrol agent, heard the news of the shooting at Robb Elementary. His wife was a teacher at the school, and his daughter was a student. He rushed to the campus and joined the officers in attempting to gain access to the classrooms that Salvador was in. Fortunately, both survived. At 12:35 p.m., just over an hour after Salvador began shooting, a Halligan tool made for breaching was brought into the school from the west entrance. 15 minutes later, at 12:50 p.m., off-duty Border Patrol officers used a janitor's master key to unlock the door that Salvador locked previously, gaining access to the classroom that Salvador was in. In a later investigative report, however, it was revealed that all along, the door wasn't even locked. Officers gained access to the classroom and found Salvador Ramos hiding in a closet. He kicked the door of the closet open and began firing at officers. Officers returned fire and killed him. 19 students and 2 teachers were killed in classrooms 111 and 112. 18 other people were injured. This included 14 children, Salvador's grandmother, 1 teacher, and 2 police officers. In the hours and days that followed the Robb Elementary School shooting, the small town of Uvalde was left completely shattered, with families desperately searching for answers, many of them waiting outside the school for hours, only to later learn the worst. Vigils were held across the city, with rows of white crosses bearing the names of the 19 children and 2 teachers who lost their lives, including Irma Garcia and Eva Morales, both of whom died protecting their students. The grief was overwhelming, not just in Uvalde, but across the United States and beyond, as people struggled to comprehend how something like this could happen, especially in a classroom full of young children. As more information came out, the focus quickly shifted to the police response, which came under intense scrutiny. It was revealed that despite officers arriving within minutes, they waited over an hour before confronting the gunman, a delay that many believe cost lives. The incident commander, Pedro Arredondo, was heavily criticized for treating the situation as a barricaded suspect rather than an active shooter, a decision that went against standard training. Investigations later found what officials described as systemic failures in leadership, communication, and urgency, with nearly 400 officers eventually responding to the scene, yet no immediate breach of the classroom. Arredondo was eventually removed from his position and later fired, and multiple investigations were launched at both the state and federal level, all pointing to the same conclusion, that the response was deeply flawed. For the families, though, no report or resignation could undo what had been done. Many of them have since fought for accountability, transparency, and change, refusing to let the victims be forgotten. Even now, Uvalde continues to carry the weight of that day, a community forever marked by loss, but also by the memory of the children and teachers whose lives were taken far too soon. In the weeks and months following the Robb Elementary School shooting, investigators began piecing together the life and actions of Salvador Ramos, trying to understand not just how the attack happened, but whether there were missed warning signs that could have prevented it. Law enforcement agencies at both the state and federal level reviewed his background in detail, speaking to family members, friends, classmates, and people he had interacted with online. What they found painted the picture of an increasingly isolated and troubled individual, but one who had largely stayed off the radar of authorities prior to the attack. Despite his troubling behavior, including online messages, threats, and posting images of firearms, there was no record of him being on any law enforcement watch list, nor had he been arrested for any serious offenses before May 24th. Investigators also examined his digital footprint, uncovering messages he had sent in the hours before the attack, including the now well-known statements about shooting his grandmother and planning to target a school, messages that, had they been seen in real time, may have changed the outcome of that day. The investigation also focused heavily on how Ramos was able to legally obtain the weapons used in the attack, purchasing AR-style rifles just days after turning 18, highlighting gaps in background check laws in the state of Texas. Officials confirmed that he passed the required checks at the time, as he had no disqualifying criminal history or documented mental health record that would have prevented the purchases. Beyond his access to weapons, authorities looked into his home life and upbringing, speaking to relatives who described a tense and unstable environment, with Ramos frequently moving between homes and having strained relationships with family members. His time in school was also reviewed, with reports confirming he had struggled academically, had poor attendance, and had eventually dropped out. But again, nothing that triggered a formal intervention from authorities. Alongside the investigation into Ramos himself, multiple official reviews were launched into the overall handling of the incident, including a major report by the Texas House of Representatives Investigative Committee, which described the events as a result of systemic failures across multiple levels. While these reports focused heavily on law enforcement response, they also reinforced the conclusion that Ramos had acted largely alone, with no evidence of a wider conspiracy or direct accomplices. In the end, the investigation into Salvador Ramos did not uncover a single clear motive, but rather a combination of isolation, anger, and warning signs that, while visible in hindsight, were never acted upon in time. The findings left many in Uvalde and beyond asking the same question, not just how this happened, but whether it could have been stopped. This brings me to the end of this video. My thoughts and prayers are with the families and friends of anyone affected by this tragedy. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe as it helps the channel grow massively. Thank you for watching.